The words sliced through the crystalline air of the ballroom like a blade finding flesh. My brother stood there with his glass raised high, his voice projecting across 200 faces that had turned toward me in perfect, synchronized horror. He announced to everyone present that I was his stinky sister, someone with no real career, no prospects ahead, just a person who did manual labor for survival. The champagne flutes froze in mid-trajectory toward painted lips. Someone in the back of the room actually released an audible sound of shock. I remained motionless in my carefully chosen dark jeans and the cream silk blouse that had consumed 3 full days of agonizing deliberation, feeling the burn crawl up my neck and into my face as ripples of mocking laughter spread through the assembled crowd like a contagion. Gregory lifted his glass even higher with that expression I knew too well, that smirk that said he had just scored a perfect point in front of everyone whose opinion he valued. My own blood relative was doing this at his merger celebration, surrounded by every person who held significance in his meticulously constructed world. What made my stomach twist into knots was not just his cruelty, but my mother's reaction. She smiled. Not broadly, not obviously, just that specific, tight compression of her lips that always appeared when Gregory reminded me of my designated place in the family hierarchy. The smile that communicated agreement without requiring the vulgarity of actual words. Let me rewind this disaster and provide some necessary context. My name is Susie Fowle, and I have existed on this planet for 34 years. According to the narrative my family has constructed around my existence, I represent the spectacular failure who excavates trenches for a living. What they remain blissfully unaware of is the actual truth. I own Fowle & Company Landscape Architecture, an operation that employs 47 people across 3 different states. The previous fiscal year saw us generate $11 million in revenue. This current year brought us a municipal contract worth $4.2 million for the comprehensive restoration of the downtown riverfront corridor. My company has appeared in Architectural Digest on 2 separate occasions. We received a National Recognition Award for our work on the Morrison Park Rehabilitation Project. But certainly, I am merely the embarrassing sister who spends her time playing in dirt. The decision to withhold all of this information from my family was not made lightly. I never mentioned the financial success, never brought up the industry awards, never casually dropped the fact that my weekly payroll distribution amounts to $47,000. I harbored this perhaps foolish notion that eventually they might perceive my actual value as a human being without requiring a numerical price tag as evidence. That perhaps, in some parallel universe where families functioned with basic decency, they might extend love to their daughter and sister based on inherent worth rather than net worth calculations. That hypothesis, as it turns out, was catastrophically incorrect. Gregory carries 4 additional years of life experience beyond my 34, though he operates with approximately 400 additional years of concentrated arrogance. He occupies himself in the financial services industry, which within our family structure essentially elevates him to the status of a minor deity. Our mother has referred to him as her little success story since he secured his initial internship at the age of 22. Every Thanksgiving gathering, every Christmas celebration, every random Tuesday telephone conversation somehow circles back with gravitational inevitability to Gregory's most recent promotion, Gregory's newly acquired luxury vehicle, Gregory's critically important client relationships. My own existence in these conversations rates occasional mention when someone remembers I still technically belong to the family unit. The commentary usually follows a predictable pattern about how Susie continues pursuing her little gardening hobby. The mischaracterization makes my teeth hurt. I have corrected this error approximately 7,000 times throughout my adult life. I hold legitimate professional licensure as a landscape architect. My work involves designing sophisticated outdoor environments, managing multi-phase construction operations, and directing a company that owns equipment fleets valued higher than Gregory's residential property. The standard response from my mother comes wrapped in dismissive sweetness. acknowledging that my activities sound nice, but questioning when I plan to obtain legitimate employment, something conducted indoors where I might avoid getting dirty. I abandoned these explanatory attempts several years ago. Some confrontations simply fail to justify the energy expenditure they demand. Or so I convinced myself until 3 weeks ago. Gregory initiated telephone contact with me 21 days before his elaborate merger celebration. He expressed a desire for my attendance, which should have triggered immediate alarm systems throughout my consciousness. Gregory typically prefers my absence from his sophisticated networking functions, where I serve as the embarrassing relative he pretends does not exist in his carefully curated professional universe. His exact verbal communication remains burned into my memory with unfortunate clarity. He told me to listen carefully, because this particular evening held tremendous importance for his career trajectory. He explained that serious individuals would occupy the venue. He then suggested, with that particular tone he employs when delivering insults disguised as helpful advice, that perhaps I should refrain from extensive discussion of my ditch-digging enterprise, because he had no interest in experiencing embarrassment. The appropriate response would have been immediate refusal. I should have explained in extremely specific terms exactly where he could relocate his invitation. But I suffer from this fatal character flaw that continues to sabotage my better judgment. Despite all evidence to the contrary, I actually maintain genuine affection for my brother. Buried beneath the accumulated layers of his insufferable superiority complex exists the child who constructed blanket fortresses with me during rainy afternoons. The teenager who demonstrated remarkable patience teaching me manual transmission operation. The person I believed would provide unconditional support throughout my life. So naturally I agreed to attend, because I apparently possess an Olympic-level talent for volunteering for punishment. The outfit selection process consumed 3 complete days of my existence. The clothing could not present as excessively formal, because Gregory would certainly mock any appearance of trying too hard. Simultaneously, excessive casualness would brand me as the slovenly relative incapable of appropriate dress standards. I ultimately settled on dark wash jeans, a cream-coloured silk blouse, and the singular pair of heeled shoes in my possession that do not trigger sobbing after 20 minutes of wear. Walking into that ballroom generated this bizarre sensation of optimism flowing through my chest. Perhaps this particular gathering would deviate from established patterns. Perhaps Gregory would introduce me with basic human decency, and I might engage in normal conversation with normal people who had not received advance notification of my worthlessness. Then my eyes registered the actual venue location, and I nearly released inappropriate laughter into the elegant atmosphere. The Grand Metropolitan Hotel stood before me, specifically the recently renovated Grand Metropolitan Hotel, featuring its award-recognized outdoor terrace, sustainable garden installations, and custom-designed water feature integration. I possessed intimate knowledge of every detail because my company designed and constructed the entire exterior transformation. We completed that project 14 months prior to this evening. A bronze identification plaque stands positioned beside the fountain in the main lobby area, displaying our company name in raised letters. Fowl & Company, right there where anyone with functional vision could observe it. My brother had walked past that marker without allocating a single second of attention to its existence. I acquired a glass of champagne from a passing server and attempted to locate some corner of the room offering relative anonymity. That strategy collapsed when I spotted my mother making her characteristically dramatic entrance, navigating directly toward Gregory with the single-minded determination of a moth drawn toward flame. She embraced him for what felt like 30 solid seconds, while I stood watching this display of maternal devotion. When her attention finally acknowledged my presence in the room, I received a brief hand gesture and a facial expression communicating a clear directive not to create problems during this important evening. I stood there thinking how lovely it felt to be invisible, How wonderful to know my business was thriving. How I had recently hired 3 new project managers, but absolutely we should dedicate more conversation to the specific details of Gregory's suit selection. I was mentally constructing my exit strategy when I felt physical contact on my shoulder. Turning around revealed Todd Brennan standing there, my former romantic partner. This was the individual who terminated our relationship 8 years prior because I was, and I can quote this precisely, going nowhere with that lawn mowing thing of mine. The man who informed me with complete certainty that I lacked ambition and would never accomplish anything meaningful with my existence. He had apparently invested in hair transplant procedures since our last encounter. The results suggested someone had applied adhesive to attach a small, frightened animal to his forehead, but certainly I was the person who had allowed herself to deteriorate. He greeted me using the diminutive version of my name that I have always despised, pretending we maintained friendly relations instead of being former partners who had not exchanged words in nearly a decade. He expressed apparent amazement that I looked essentially unchanged. I thanked him with extreme politeness and observed that he looked remarkably different, particularly in the hairline region. The sarcasm sailed completely over his reconstructed head because subtle humour had never registered within his comprehension abilities. The universe was apparently committed to making this evening progressively worse because Todd had materialised as one of Gregory's potential investors. Of course he occupied that role, because this disaster required additional accelerant. Before I could manufacture an excuse to relocate myself to literally any other location on the planet, Gregory created that distinctive sound of glass being struck to demand attention. He pulled me toward his position with one arm, while that enormous fraudulent smile spread across his features, and then he delivered his verbal assault. He announced to the assembled crowd that he wanted to introduce his family members. He identified his beautiful wife, Vanessa. He recognized his wonderful mother, Diane. And then he presented me with those exact words that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. "This is my stinky sister," he proclaimed. "Someone without legitimate employment, without future prospects, merely a manual labourer." The room erupted with sounds of amusement. My mother smiled her approval. Todd expelled champagne through his nasal passages, which provided the singular, satisfying moment of the entire catastrophic evening. I remained frozen in position, processing the reality that I had invested 34 years loving people who could not manage to fake respect for me, even in public settings. But existing your entire life under the weight of low expectations teaches valuable skills. You learn the art of observation. You develop patience. You notice details that other people overlook in their haste to judgment. Like the way Gregory kept checking his phone with barely controlled panic flickering across his features. The way his smile failed to reach his eyes despite the celebration. The way he consumed 3 glasses of champagne in 20 minutes. Something was fundamentally wrong with my brother's situation. And one elderly gentleman, positioned in the corner of the room, was noticing it too. He was not laughing at Gregory's cruel joke. He was watching my brother with the concentrated attention of a predator identifying prey. Our eyes met across the crowded space. He raised his glass toward me in a gesture so slight that anyone not paying attention would have missed it completely. I had no information about his identity, but I was about to discover exactly who he was and why his presence at this celebration would change absolutely everything. The celebration continued swirling around me, as though Gregory's public humiliation of his sister represented nothing more than momentary entertainment, already forgotten by people who had more important networking to accomplish. I could still feel the echo of those words reverberating through my ribcage. That familiar sensation of being designated the family disappointment. Vanessa glided past me, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people earn in a month, shooting me a glance that combined pity with something resembling vindication, as though Gregory's commentary had confirmed suspicions she had harboured about me all along. I observed her linking arms with my mother, the two of them moving through the crowd like synchronized performers in some elaborate social ballet. They were laughing about something, heads tilted together in that conspiratorial manner that excluded everyone outside their intimate circle. I wondered briefly if they were discussing me, if my mother was explaining to her daughter-in-law how she had produced one successful child and one unfortunate mistake. The champagne in my glass had gone warm. I set it down on a passing server's tray and considered my options. I could leave immediately, preserve whatever remained of my dignity, drive home to my quiet house and spend the evening with my dog who actually appreciated my existence. Or I could stay, endure whatever additional humiliation the evening had prepared for me, and maintain the fiction that I belonged in this family. The decision was made for me when Todd materialized at my elbow again, apparently incapable of reading social cues or basic human body language. He launched into this monologue about his investment portfolio, his recent vacation to somewhere expensive and tropical, his new luxury vehicle that he described with more passion than he had ever displayed toward me during our relationship. I made appropriate sounds at appropriate intervals, while my brain occupied itself with calculating exactly how much of my company's equipment could crush his car into a compact cube. He eventually arrived at the actual point of his verbal assault, asking if I was still doing that outdoor work thing, or if I had finally gotten a real job. The question hung in the air between us like visible pollution. I informed him with excessive politeness that I was indeed still working in landscape architecture. He nodded, with this expression that communicated both understanding and profound dismissal, the look of someone who believes they are being kind by acknowledging your sad little hobby. He mentioned that he had always known I had potential if I just applied myself to something legitimate. He actually used those exact words, as though my licensed professional career represented a phase I had not yet outgrown. Then he transitioned into what I can only describe as the world's most delusional attempt at romantic reconnection. He suggested that perhaps we could get together sometime, grab coffee, catch up on old times. He said this while standing in a ballroom where my brother had just publicly declared me worthless, as though that somehow represented the ideal moment to propose renewed intimacy. I watched his mouth moving, forming words that my brain refused to process as serious communication, and I experienced this bizarre, out-of-body sensation where I could observe myself standing there tolerating this interaction, instead of walking away, like any person with functional self-preservation instincts would do. I was formulating a response that would communicate rejection, without providing him the satisfaction of knowing he had affected me, when I noticed the elderly gentleman from the corner making his way through the crowd in our direction. He moved with purpose despite his age, navigating between clusters of conversation with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in expensive social settings. He was distinguished in that way some men achieve in their later years: silver hair perfectly maintained, suit tailored with precision, posture suggesting military background or exceptional discipline. When he reached us, he extended his hand toward me and introduced himself as Warren Beckford. The name triggered immediate recognition in my industry-trained brain. Warren Beckford had built and sold one of the largest commercial real estate development companies in the region before retiring 5 years ago. He was legendary, the kind of person whose business decisions got analysed in graduate school case studies. And he was standing in front of me, shaking my hand with genuine warmth, completely ignoring Todd's presence beside me. He said he had been hoping to meet me all evening, that he recognized me from the bronze plaque in the hotel lobby. He explained that he had served on the selection committee that awarded my company the Grand Metropolitan Restoration contract. He described our work as exceptional, innovative, exactly the kind of sustainable design the hospitality industry desperately needed. I felt my face flush, but this time the heat came from something other than humiliation. He asked if I had a few minutes to discuss a potential project he was considering, something involving a mixed-use development that would require extensive landscape architecture input. Todd was staring at both of us like we had started speaking an alien language, his mouth hanging open in that particularly unflattering way that made him look like a confused fish. Warren guided me away from Todd without acknowledging his existence, leading me toward a quieter section of the ballroom where we could conduct actual conversation. He asked about my company's capacity for large-scale projects, our timeline availability, our experience with commercial versus residential work. I answered his questions with the professional competence I had spent years developing, explaining our current project load, our team structure, our design philosophy. He listened with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated real understanding of the industry complexities. We talked for perhaps 20 minutes, and during that entire exchange, I felt something unfamiliar and precious. I felt respected. I felt seen. I felt like my expertise mattered to someone who understood its value. Warren eventually excused himself to speak with other guests, but not before extracting my business card and promising to contact me the following week with specific project details. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had been observing Gregory throughout the evening. He said something seemed off about my brother's behavior, the kind of nervous energy that suggested serious problems lurking beneath surface confidence. He asked, very carefully, if everything was all right with my family situation. I appreciated his concern, but assured him that family dynamics were complicated and probably not worth his worry. He nodded with an expression suggesting he understood far more than I had articulated. As he walked away, I watched him pause briefly to speak with Gregory, whose face transformed through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, forced pleasure, barely concealed anxiety. I found myself standing alone again, processing what had just occurred. Warren Beckford, actual Warren Beckford, wanted to discuss hiring my company. He had recognized my work, valued my expertise, treated me like the professional I actually was. The contrast with Gregory's introduction earlier in the evening could not have been more extreme. I was contemplating this irony when my mother appeared beside me with that particular energy she radiates when she has decided to address an uncomfortable subject. She asked what I had been discussing with that important-looking gentleman. I explained that Warren Beckford had expressed interest in my company's services for a potential development project. My mother's face went through this fascinating journey of emotions, confusion followed by disbelief, followed by something that might have been actual curiosity. She asked how I knew Warren Beckford, her tone suggesting that someone of his stature should not be acknowledging my existence. I explained about the hotel restoration work, about the selection committee, about the bronze plaque in the lobby with my company name displayed for anyone to see. She stared at me for a long moment, and I watched her mental gears turning, attempting to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with this new information that contradicted her established narrative. She opened her mouth to ask another question, but Gregory's voice cut through the room again, announcing that dinner would be served shortly and requesting everyone move toward the dining area. The dining room had been arranged with several large tables, each decorated with centerpieces that I recognized as coming from my company's partner florist. I ended up seated at a table with Todd, unfortunately, along with several people I did not know who introduced themselves with names and job titles I immediately forgot. Gregory sat at the head table with Vanessa, my mother, and several individuals who carried themselves with the self-importance of people accustomed to being the most significant presence in any room. Warren Beckford was seated at that table as well, positioned directly across from Gregory. I watched my brother's body language throughout the meal, the way he kept checking his phone beneath the table, the way he barely touched his food despite the obvious expense that had gone into its preparation. Vanessa seemed oblivious to his distress, chatting animatedly with my mother about vacation destinations and upcoming charity events. The conversation at my table eventually turned to what everyone did professionally. Todd took this opportunity to describe his investment work, with the enthusiasm of someone who believes their career represents the pinnacle of human achievement. When attention turned to me, I kept my response vague, mentioning that I worked in landscape architecture. One woman at the table perked up at this, asking if I had any involvement with the hotel's outdoor spaces, because she thought they were absolutely stunning. Before I could respond, Todd jumped in to explain that I did small-scale residential work, nothing commercial, just basic gardening services for private homes. The lie sat there on the table between us like rotting fruit. I looked at Todd, this man who had dumped me for lacking ambition, this man who was now actively diminishing my actual accomplishments to strangers, and I made a decision. I corrected him with pointed clarity, explaining that my company had designed and built the entire exterior restoration of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. I mentioned the Architectural Digest features, the National Award, the 11 million in annual revenue. I watched Todd's face drain of colour as the woman who had asked the initial question expressed amazement and began asking detailed questions about our design process. The table's attention had shifted completely. People were looking at me with new interest, pulling out phones to search for my company, asking for business cards. Todd sat frozen, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning fog under direct sunlight. I answered questions, discussed projects, felt that same sensation I had experienced talking with Warren. Respect, recognition, value. And then Gregory's phone rang, the sound cutting through the dining room's ambient noise like an alarm. He grabbed it with the desperation of a drowning person reaching for rescue. His face went absolutely white as he listened to whoever was speaking on the other end. He said something about a warrant, his voice loud enough to draw attention from surrounding tables. Everyone watched as he looked up with wild eyes and finally noticed the two individuals who had quietly entered the dining room during dessert service. A man and a woman, both dressed in suits that communicated federal government employment, both wearing expressions of professional calm that suggested they had done this many times before. The mail agent stepped forward, with credentials already in hand, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent dining room with practiced authority. He identified himself as Agent Williams from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and explained that they had questions for Gregory Fowle regarding financial fraud and the misappropriation of funds. He requested, with the kind of politeness that made clear this was not actually a request, that Gregory accompany them for questioning. My brother's mouth opened and closed repeatedly without producing coherent sound, his face cycling through shades of white and grey that suggested imminent cardiovascular failure. He finally managed to sputter that this was insane, that he had done nothing wrong, that there must be some terrible mistake. The female agent produced documentation from her leather portfolio, unfolding it with deliberate care. She explained that they also possessed a warrant related to elder financial abuse, specifically addressing unauthorized transfer of funds from accounts belonging to Harold Fowle, Gregory's father. My father's name hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Dad looked up from his dessert plate at the sound of his own name, confusion spreading across his features as he tried to process what was happening around him. He asked what was going on, his voice carrying that particular tremor that had become more pronounced over the past 2 years as his cognitive abilities deteriorated. My mother's face had frozen into an expression somewhere between horror and complete incomprehension. Vanessa sat motionless, with her champagne glass suspended halfway to her lips, as though someone had pressed pause on her existence. Gregory turned toward me, and his eyes blazed with fury and desperation in equal measure. He accused me directly, his finger actually pointing in my direction like a weapon. He declared that I had orchestrated this entire situation, that I was responsible for whatever nightmare was unfolding. I stood slowly from my chair, taking my time to smooth my blouse and collect myself before responding. I told him with absolute clarity that he had done this to himself, that I had merely ensured everyone discovered the truth. I addressed the entire table, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline flooding my system. I explained that my brother had stolen over $340,000 from our father during the past 2 years. I detailed how he had taken out loans against Dad's house without obtaining informed consent, how he had exploited our father's trust and declining health to fund his lifestyle while his company collapsed around him. I looked directly at the investors and business partners seated at the head table, the people Gregory had been courting for his merger deal. I told them that their potential partnership would have made them accessories to his fraud, that Warren Beckford had done them a tremendous favour by whatever investigation he had quietly initiated. I turned my attention to my mother, watching her face as I explained how she had placed Gregory in charge of Dad's finances because she believed he was the successful child, the competent one, while I was just the stinky sister with no real job who could not be trusted with important matters. Finally, I looked at Gregory and let him see everything I had been hiding for years. I told him that I owned a company worth $12 million. I explained that I employed 47 people. I mentioned the $4.2 million contract I had just signed with the city. I referenced the features in Architectural Digest, the National Design Award, all the accomplishments he knew nothing about because he had never bothered to ask. I told him that I had never shared any of this information because I wanted him to love me for who I was rather than what I was worth, because I had foolishly believed that family meant something beyond financial calculations and social status comparisons. The dining room had achieved complete silence. You could have heard individual heartbeats if you listened carefully enough. I continued speaking, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. I told him that he had failed that test spectacularly, that he had humiliated me, dismissed me, and worst of all, stolen from the man who had worked 40 years to provide us with comfortable lives. Gregory's face crumpled like paper being crushed in a fist. He begged me to help him, his voice breaking as he pleaded with me to tell the agents this was all a misunderstanding, that surely I could fix this situation. Agent Williams stepped forward again, his patience clearly exhausted. He informed Gregory that they needed him to accompany them immediately. No further delays would be tolerated. As they escorted Gregory toward the exit, he looked back at me one final time. The golden child mask had completely disintegrated. He just looked small and terrified and pathetic, stripped of all the arrogance that had defined him for as long as I could remember. I felt no triumph washing through me, no satisfaction at watching his downfall, just this deep, exhausted sadness settling into my bones. But underneath that sadness lived something else, something I had not experienced in years when it came to my family. Relief. Because finally, after 34 years of performance and pretense, the truth had escaped into open air where everyone could see it. Vanessa stood abruptly with such force that her chair nearly toppled backward. She fumbled for her phone and started dialing while fleeing the dining room, her voice carrying back to us as she demanded to speak with a lawyer. And oh yes, she would also need a divorce attorney immediately. Todd remained frozen at our table with his mouth hanging open in that deeply unattractive manner he had perfected. He had almost invested his money with Gregory. He had almost tied his financial future to a federal criminal. He stared at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time in his life, perhaps the first time ever. He asked if I really owned a $12 million company, his voice pitched high with disbelief. I told him goodbye with finality, watching the word land on him like a door slamming shut. I walked over to where my father sat, looking lost and confused, taking his weathered hand in mine. He looked up at me with tears pooling in his eyes, magnified by his thick glasses. He whispered that he was sorry, that he had not known what Gregory was doing, that he had trusted his son implicitly. I squeezed his hand and assured him that none of this was his fault, that trust between family members should never be weaponized the way Gregory had weaponized it. I promised him that I would take care of everything now, that he did not need to worry about finances or houses or any of it. He squeezed my hand back with surprising strength and told me that I had always been the good one, that he should have seen it earlier, should have recognized my value before circumstances forced the truth into daylight. We sat together holding hands while chaos swirled around us like a storm we were observing from inside shelter. Mum was crying with these harsh, gasping sounds that suggested genuine shock rather than performative emotion. The investors and business partners were making hurried phone calls, already distancing themselves from the disaster that had been Gregory's merger celebration. Warren Beckford sat quietly, finishing his wine with the air of someone who had witnessed many empires crumble and knew exactly how these situations resolved themselves. Outside the dining room windows, I could see Gregory being helped into an unmarked vehicle. They had not handcuffed him yet, but his career was finished, his reputation destroyed, his marriage dissolved, his freedom hanging by increasingly fragile threads. The stinky sister had emerged victorious from a battle she had not realized she was fighting until the weapons came out. The dining room had emptied quickly after Gregory's arrest, guests fleeing the scene like survivors of a natural disaster. Only a few people remained, Warren Beckford among them. He approached me where I sat with Dad, his expression carrying something I had not seen before: vulnerability. He asked if we could speak privately for a moment, and I followed him to a quiet corner of the now abandoned dining room. What he told me changed my understanding of everything that had just happened. Warren explained that he had lost his own father to a similar scheme years ago, a trusted family member who had drained accounts and taken out loans while his father's dementia progressed. By the time Warren discovered the theft, his father had died and the money was gone. He said he had sworn then that he would never ignore signs of elder financial abuse if he encountered them again. When he saw Gregory's nervous behavior at the merger party, when he heard how Gregory spoke about me, every alarm in his experienced mind had triggered. He had made discreet inquiries with contacts in the financial sector, discovering quickly that Gregory's company was drowning in debt and desperate decisions. Warren had simply ensured the proper authorities had the documentation they needed to act. He told me this not seeking gratitude, but offering explanation, helping me understand that Gregory's downfall was not random cosmic justice, but the result of someone who had learned from painful experience that silence enables predators. I thanked Warren with genuine emotion, understanding now why he had shown me such respect from our first interaction. He had seen my value immediately because he knew what it looked like when family members were dismissed and devalued. We shook hands and he told me that we would speak soon about business matters, but tonight was about family and healing. I returned to Dad's side and helped him to his feet. Mum was waiting by the exit, her face ravaged by crying, looking older than I had ever seen her. We drove home in silence, the three of us processing what had happened in our own ways. The next morning, my phone rang before I had finished my first coffee. Sandra Chen's assistant, polite but firm, explaining that Ms. Chen needed to reschedule our meeting indefinitely. The development group had concerns about moving forward, given the recent publicity surrounding my family. They would be in touch if circumstances changed. I sat staring at my phone, watching my biggest opportunity dissolve because my brother's crimes had contaminated my reputation by association. The stinky sister had exposed the golden child, but the cost was higher than I had anticipated. This was not over. The real fight was just beginning. The rejection from Sandra Chen's development group was just the beginning. Over the next week, 3 other potential clients called to cancel preliminary meetings. One of them was honest enough to explain that associating their project with my family's scandal felt like unnecessary risk. My company name was appearing in news articles not for our award-winning work, but as a footnote in stories about Gregory's fraud. The stinky sister who exposed her brother's crimes. My crew noticed the tension even though I tried to hide it. Projects already underway continued smoothly, but new business had frozen solid. I spent a morning reviewing our financial projections, calculating how long we could sustain operations if this continued. The numbers were uncomfortable, but not catastrophic. We had built enough momentum to weather this storm, but watching years of reputation building threatened by association with Gregory's failures made my jaw ache from clenching. Warren called on the 5th day of this freeze. suggesting lunch at a small cafe far from his usual exclusive haunts. He ordered coffee and got straight to the point. Sandra Chen's group was having internal debates about the project. Half the board wanted to move forward based on my company's proven track record. The other half worried about optics and investor reactions. He had been making calls, leveraging relationships, reminding people that my work spoke for itself, regardless of family drama. He asked what I planned to do about the situation, and I told him the truth. I planned to work harder than ever, to deliver such exceptional results on current projects that new clients would seek us out despite the noise. He smiled at that response and said it was exactly what he had hoped to hear. Then he told me he had arranged something, a presentation to Sandra Chen's full board in 3 days, 1 hour to make my case, to show them why Fowle and Company deserve the contract based on merit alone. No favours, no special treatment, just an opportunity to compete on equal ground. I felt gratitude wash through me, but also determination. This was my chance to prove that I was not defined by my brother's crimes or my family's dysfunction. The presentation preparation consumed the next 72 hours. I assembled a portfolio showcasing our most complex projects with before and after documentation, client testimonials, evidence of on-time and on-budget delivery. I prepared responses to every concern they might raise about the scandal, about my judgment, about risk management. My lead designer helped refine the visual materials, while my project managers verified every statistic and claim. We built a case that was bulletproof, because anything less would fail. The morning of the presentation, I dressed in my most professional suit and drove to their offices with my stomach churning acid. The boardroom held 8 people, Sandra Chen among them, all watching me with expressions ranging from curious to openly skeptical. I had 60 minutes to change their minds. I opened not with my company's achievements, but with an acknowledgement of the elephant crushing the room. I addressed Gregory's crimes directly, explaining that I had been the one who discovered the theft and ensured authorities had the information they needed. I described how my company had been built on integrity and transparency, values that had led me to expose fraud even when the perpetrator was family. Then I shifted to the work itself, walking them through project after project, demonstrating our capacity and excellence. Questions came hard and skeptical. How could they trust my judgment when I had not seen my own brother's criminal behaviour sooner? I explained that Gregory's fraud had been sophisticated and hidden, that discovering it had required extensive investigation, that the same attention to detail I applied in that investigation was how I managed every project. By the end of the hour, the skepticism had shifted to something else, not certainty but possibility. Sandra Chen called me 2 days after the presentation. Her voice carried that specific quality of someone delivering news they are pleased about. The board had voted to move forward with Fowle and Company as the lead landscape architecture firm for the development project. $3.1 million for comprehensive services. She said my presentation had been the deciding factor, that my willingness to address the scandal directly, rather than avoiding it, had demonstrated exactly the kind of integrity they needed in a partner. The contract would arrive by the end of the week. I thanked her with as much professionalism as I could manage, while my hands were shaking with relief and triumph. After ending the call, I sat in my office for several minutes, just breathing, letting the weight of the past weeks lift slightly. I had fought for this. I had earned it, despite every obstacle thrown in my path. This was not handed to me because of family connections or luck. This was mine because I had refused to quit. The newspaper article appeared 3 days after Gregory's arrest, a small piece buried in the business section that most people probably skipped over while searching for stock quotes. The headline read something forgettable about a local financial executive facing fraud charges. The article mentioned Gregory by name, identified his company, referenced the FBI investigation. It did not mention me at all, which was exactly how I preferred the situation. I had asked Warren to keep my involvement quiet, and he had honoured that request with the discretion that comes from decades navigating complex business relationships. The story belonged to Gregory's choices and their consequences, not to his sister's revelation. My phone started ringing that afternoon with calls from people I had not spoken to in years. High school acquaintances who suddenly remembered our friendship. Distant cousins who wanted to check on how I was handling this family crisis. Former colleagues from my early career who had heard rumours and wanted to verify the gossip. I let most calls go to voicemail, having no interest in performing emotional labour for people whose concern was really just curiosity wrapped in false sympathy. One call I did answer came from my Aunt Carol, my father's sister, who I had always liked despite her limited presence in our lives. She had heard about Gregory's arrest through the Family Information Network and wanted to make sure Dad was being taken care of properly. I assured her that I had everything under control, that Dad was safe and his finances were secured. She asked how I was managing the situation emotionally, and I found myself answering honestly. I told her that I felt sad about Gregory's choices, but relieved that the truth was finally visible. She made this sound of understanding, and then said something I had not expected. She told me that she had always known I was the strong one, the capable one, even when everyone else was busy celebrating Gregory's achievements. Gregory's preliminary hearing happened on a Thursday morning in a courthouse I had never entered before. I attended despite having no legal obligation to be present, sitting in the back row of the public gallery where I could observe without being obvious. He appeared wearing an orange jumpsuit that stripped away every pretense of sophistication he had spent years constructing. His lawyer, someone expensive judging by the quality of his briefcase and watch, argued for bail reduction based on Gregory's community ties and lack of flight risk. The prosecutor, a tired-looking woman with exceptional organisational skills evident in her file system, presented evidence of Gregory's financial desperation and the serious nature of the charges. She mentioned the elder abuse component with particular emphasis, explaining how he had systematically drained his father's accounts while his father's cognitive abilities declined. The judge, an older man who had clearly seen every variety of human failing during his years on the bench, listened with an expression suggesting zero patience for financial predators who targeted vulnerable family members. He denied the bail reduction request and scheduled the next hearing for 6 weeks out. Gregory's shoulders slumped as the bailiff led him back toward holding. He never looked toward the gallery, never saw me sitting there watching his public humiliation mirror the private humiliation he had inflicted on me. I left the courthouse feeling neither vindicated nor satisfied, just tired of the entire situation. Mum called me that evening, her voice carrying strain that made her sound decades older than her actual age. She asked if I had attended the hearing, and I confirmed that I had. She wanted to know why, what purpose it served for me to watch my brother's degradation. I explained that I needed to see the reality of consequences, needed to witness accountability happening in real time. She was quiet for a long moment, before asking the question I knew had been building. She wanted to know why I had never told the family about my company, about my success, about any of it. I took a deep breath and gave her the truth. I said I had wanted to be loved for who I was, rather than what I had accomplished financially. I explained that I had hoped my family might value me as a person before they knew my net worth. She started defending herself, saying she had always loved me, that I was being unfair. I let her finish before pointing out that love requires basic respect, and she had shown me none. The conversation ended badly, with neither of us satisfied. 2 weeks later, she called again. This time her tone was different. She said she had been talking to her therapist, someone she had started seeing after Gregory's arrest, and she was beginning to understand how her behaviour had damaged our relationship. She did not ask for forgiveness. She asked instead what she could do to demonstrate that she wanted to change. I told her that words were meaningless without action, that she would need to show me over time that she saw me differently. She agreed without argument, accepting the consequences of her failures. It was not closure, but it was progress. But it was more honest than any conversation we had ever had before. Warren had simply accelerated the inevitable collapse by ensuring the proper authorities had access to documentation they needed. I asked if he had known about me, about my company and its success, before that evening. He smiled and admitted that he had done his research after seeing my name on the hotel plaque. He knew exactly who I was and what I had built when he approached me at the party. He said watching Gregory humiliate someone of my professional caliber had been darkly amusing in its irony. Our lunch arrived and we shifted conversation to the development project, discussing technical challenges and design possibilities with the comfortable familiarity of two people who understood the same professional language. Warren mentioned that he was considering coming out of retirement for this particular development, that working with my company on something meaningful appealed to him more than endless golf games and charity board meetings. He asked if I would be interested in a longer-term partnership arrangement, where his experience in large-scale development could complement my design expertise. The opportunity he was describing would catapult Fowle & Company into a completely different tier of the industry. I told him I would need to review the specifics with my team and my lawyer, but that I was definitely interested in exploring the possibility. We shook hands over coffee and dessert, sealing an informal agreement that felt more binding than many legal contracts I had signed. Walking out of that exclusive club into afternoon sunshine, I experienced this profound sense of arrival, like I had finally reached a destination I had been traveling toward without knowing the endpoint existed. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad, asking if I could stop by the house later. He wanted to show me something in his garden, some new tomato variety he had planted that was producing exceptional fruit. I texted back that I would be there within the hour, feeling grateful that these simple moments with my father were now possible without the shadow of Gregory's theft hanging over everything. Dad was indeed in his garden when I arrived, kneeling beside his tomato plants with that focused concentration he brought to anything growing under his care. He looked up when he heard my footsteps on the gravel path, and his face transformed with genuine pleasure at seeing me. We spent 20 minutes examining his tomatoes, while he explained the specific characteristics of this heirloom variety, why the fruit developed such intense flavor, how the plant structure differed from commercial hybrids. He had always been like this with his garden, able to discuss plant biology and soil chemistry with the passion most people reserve for sports teams or political opinions. I realized with sudden clarity that I had inherited my love of landscape work from him, that my career was not some random choice, but a genetic echo of his passion. When we finally went inside for the tea Mum had prepared, Dad sat me down at the kitchen table, with an expression suggesting serious conversation was coming. He told me that he had been reviewing the financial documents I had provided, the trust paperwork and account statements, showing that his house was secure and his care was funded. He said he understood now what Gregory had done, how his own son had systematically stolen from him, while pretending to provide financial management. But what he wanted me to know, what he needed to say directly, was how proud he was of me for building something real and lasting with my life. He said he had always known I was special, even when I was a little girl covered in mud from digging in his flower beds. He apologized for not defending me more strongly when Gregory and Mum dismissed my career choices. He admitted that he had taken the path of least resistance, avoiding conflict instead of standing up for what was right. I held Dad's weathered hand across the kitchen table and told him that I understood, that family dynamics were complicated and people made choices they later regretted. What mattered now was moving forward with honesty and mutual respect. Mum joined us at the table, setting down a teapot and cups with careful precision. She had been crying again, based on the redness around her eyes, but her voice was steady when she spoke. She said she had been doing a lot of thinking since the merger party disaster, examining her own behaviour and assumptions over the years. She acknowledged that she had elevated Gregory's achievements while dismissing mine, that she had valued the appearance of success over actual character and competence. She admitted that her own insecurity about social status had made her prioritize Gregory's white-collar career over my hands-on work, even though my company generated more revenue and employed more people than Gregory ever had. She asked if I could forgive her for being such a failure as a mother, for caring more about what the neighbours thought than about her own daughter's happiness. I looked at this woman who had given birth to me and raised me and damaged me in ways both intentional and unconscious. I told her that forgiveness was not a single moment, but a process that would take time and effort from both of us. I said I was willing to try rebuilding our relationship if she was genuinely committed to seeing me clearly, instead of through the distorted lens of her own anxieties and prejudices. She nodded and reached across the table to take my other hand, creating this chain of 3 people connected by blood and damage and tentative hope. Gregory's trial date was set for 4 months out, giving both prosecution and defence time to prepare their cases and negotiate potential plea arrangements. His lawyer contacted me through my own attorney, requesting a meeting to discuss possible testimony I might provide regarding family dynamics and my father's mental state. I declined through my lawyer, making clear that I would cooperate with legal requirements if subpoenaed, but had no interest in voluntary participation in Gregory's defence strategy. The lawyer tried again 2 weeks later with a different approach, suggesting that Gregory was deeply remorseful and hoping for family reconciliation. I had my attorney deliver a simple message in response. Gregory had numerous opportunities over the past 34 years to treat me with basic human decency, and had chosen mockery instead. His current remorse was motivated by legal consequences rather than genuine understanding of the harm he had caused. I would not be providing him emotional support or character testimony. If he wanted to demonstrate actual change, he could start by pleading guilty and saving our father the trauma of testifying at trial. The lawyer did not contact me again after that. 3 weeks later, news came through legal channels that Gregory had accepted a plea agreement. He would plead guilty to federal fraud charges and state elder abuse charges in exchange for a recommended sentence of 6 years in federal prison, followed by probation and restitution requirements. The plea required him to allocate in court, meaning he would have to stand before a judge and describe his crimes in detail, admitting what he had done to our father. I attended the plea hearing with Dad, both of us sitting in the same back row where I had watched the bail hearing months earlier. Gregory looked smaller somehow, diminished in ways that went beyond the weight he had lost during incarceration. When the judge asked him to describe his crimes, his voice shook as he explained how he had forged his father's signature on loan documents, how he had transferred funds without authorization, how he had exploited his father's declining cognitive function to maintain control of accounts he was systematically draining. Dad sat beside me with tears running down his face, hearing his son describe the betrayal in clinical, legal language. Then something unexpected happened. Gregory asked if he could address the court beyond his prepared statement. His lawyer looked alarmed, but the judge allowed it. Gregory turned slightly in my direction, though he did not quite meet my eyes. He said that his sister had tried to help him see reason years ago, that she had questioned some of his decisions, that he had dismissed her concerns because he thought he knew better. He said he hoped someday I might forgive him, not just for stealing from our father, but for treating me with such contempt when I had been right all along. The words hung in the air like smoke. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated by this public acknowledgement. Another part, the part that remembered building blanket forts with him as children, felt only sadness for how completely he had destroyed himself. I sat motionless, giving him nothing, because some apologies come too late to matter, and this was one of them. The judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks out. As we left the courtroom, Dad leaned heavily on my arm, looking every one of his 72 years. He said he never imagined one of his children would hurt him like this, that some part of him had still been hoping for an explanation that would make it all make sense. I told him that some things do not make sense, that Gregory's choices came from character flaws that probably developed long before the financial desperation that triggered his crimes. We drove home in silence, the kind of quiet that comes from emotional exhaustion rather than lack of things to say. The downtown riverfront project was moving into active construction phase, which meant I was spending 10 to 12 hours daily on site, managing crews and solving problems as they emerged. The work was physically demanding and mentally engaging in ways that left no room for dwelling on family drama. I was standing in a half-excavated area, discussing drainage solutions with my lead engineer, when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost sent it to voicemail, but something made me answer. A woman's voice identified herself as a producer for a national morning show, explaining that they were doing a segment on successful women entrepreneurs in male-dominated industries. Someone had referred her to me, she would not say who, and she wanted to know if I would be interested in being featured in their series. The exposure would be significant, millions of viewers, excellent for business development. I told her I needed to think about it and would call back within 24 hours. After ending the call, I sat on the excavated ground considering the implications. More publicity meant more attention to the Gregory situation. It meant potential clients examining my family history instead of my work quality. But it also meant visibility for my company and validation for women who worked in fields where people assumed they did not belong. I called Warren that evening to discuss the opportunity. He listened to my concerns and then asked a simple question. Why did I really hesitate? Was it fear of judgment or something else? I admitted that part of me still wanted to stay invisible, to avoid the scrutiny that came with public recognition. He pointed out gently that I had already lost invisibility when I exposed Gregory, that hiding now would not protect me from anything. He suggested I decide based on what I wanted to build, rather than what I wanted to avoid. The next morning, I called the producer back and agreed to the interview. Not because I needed publicity for business purposes, but because I wanted other women who worked with their hands to see someone like them being celebrated instead of dismissed. The television crew arrived on site with equipment that seemed excessive for filming someone discussing landscape architecture. 3 cameras, elaborate lighting setups, sound equipment that required its own technician. The producer, a woman named Jennifer, who radiated that particular energy of someone who has consumed too much coffee and not enough sleep, explained that they wanted to capture the reality of my work environment rather than filming in some sterile studio. She wanted viewers to see me doing actual work, interacting with my crew, demonstrating the physical and intellectual demands of landscape architecture. I spent 4 hours being filmed while explaining design concepts, discussing sustainable practices, operating equipment, and managing my team through normal daily challenges. The segment they were building would only run 8 minutes when edited, but they needed extensive footage to craft their narrative. Jennifer asked questions about being a woman in a male-dominated field, about building a multi-million-dollar company while family members dismissed my work, about finding success in unconventional ways. I answered honestly, describing the journey from that first small residential project to landing major commercial contracts. I talked about the satisfaction of creating beautiful, functional spaces that would serve communities for generations. I mentioned, when asked directly, that my family had not initially understood or valued my career choice, but that recent events had forced necessary conversations about respect and recognition. The interview segment took place in my office, a converted warehouse space with exposed brick and massive windows overlooking the equipment yard. Jennifer asked about my brother's legal situation and whether his crimes had affected my business. I explained that Gregory's choices belonged to him alone, that my company's reputation was built on 15 years of excellent work and satisfied clients. I said that family dysfunction was unfortunately common, but using it as an excuse for theft and fraud was a choice that revealed character rather than circumstance. She asked if I had forgiven Gregory, and I paused before answering. I said forgiveness was complicated when dealing with someone who had caused harm to vulnerable people, that my priority was protecting my father and ensuring Gregory faced appropriate consequences. I mentioned that rebuilding any relationship with my brother would require him demonstrating genuine change over years, not months, and that I was not optimistic about his capacity for that kind of transformation. Jennifer seemed satisfied with my responses, saying that authenticity resonated with viewers far more than polished corporate talking points. The crew packed up their equipment late in the afternoon, and Jennifer promised the segment would air within 2 weeks. She said she thought viewers would respond powerfully to my story, that women across the country were hungry to see success that looked different from traditional corporate ladder climbing. Gregory's sentencing hearing fell on a cold morning in late autumn, the kind of day where wind cuts through clothing and reminds you that winter is approaching, whether you are ready or not. I attended alone this time, having encouraged Dad to stay home because watching his son receive prison time would serve no beneficial purpose. The courtroom was less crowded than previous hearings, just lawyers and court personnel, and a handful of people whose connection to the case I could not identify. Gregory was led in, wearing the same orange jumpsuit, his face gaunt and pale under the fluorescent lighting. The judge, the same stern older man who had accepted his plea, asked if Gregory wished to make a statement before sentencing. Gregory stood with his lawyer beside him and read from a prepared statement expressing remorse for his actions. He apologized to his father, to his family, to the investors he had defrauded. His voice cracked multiple times, and tears ran down his face as he described the shame he felt about betraying people who had trusted him. It was a decent performance, probably coached by his lawyer to maximize sympathy. The judge listened without visible reaction, then delivered his decision with the measured cadence of someone who had given hundreds of similar speeches. He described Gregory's crimes as particularly reprehensible because they targeted his own elderly father during a period of cognitive decline. He noted the significant financial harm and the violation of familial trust. He sentenced Gregory to 6 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years supervised release and restitution of $340,000 plus interest. Gregory's shoulders slumped as the bailiff approached to return him to custody. As they led him past my row, our eyes met for a brief moment. I saw no recognition in his gaze, no acknowledgement of my presence. He looked through me, the same way he had looked through me for 34 years. Some people never actually see you, no matter how many opportunities you provide. The National Morning Show segment aired on a Tuesday 3 weeks after filming, during the time slot between weather and celebrity gossip. My phone started ringing at 6:30 in the morning, with texts from people who had seen the promotional clips announcing the segment. I did not watch it live, choosing instead to focus on work and let other people tell me how it went. By noon, my office voicemail was full, and my email inbox contained over 200 messages. The response was apparently overwhelming. The show's website had posted extended interview footage along with information about my company. Their social media accounts were flooded with comments from women thanking me for representing manual labor and unconventional career paths as legitimate routes to success. Several industry publications reached out requesting interviews. 3 different universities asked if I would be interested in guest lecturing about landscape architecture and entrepreneurship. A book agent contacted me about writing a memoir, which I declined because I had no interest in becoming a professional storyteller about my own dysfunction. Warren called laughing, saying his phone had been ringing all morning with people asking if he knew me and could facilitate introductions. He said I had become something of a folk hero for women in construction and design fields. I told him that seemed excessive for an 8-minute television segment, but he insisted the response indicated I had tapped into something people were hungry for: authentic success stories that did not follow traditional scripts. Mum watched the segment at her friend's house because she still had not mastered recording technology on her television. She called me that afternoon with an emotion in her voice I had never heard before. Pride. Unqualified, uncomplicated pride in her daughter. She said watching me on national television explaining my work and my company had finally made her understand what I had been trying to tell her for years. She saw me operating heavy equipment, discussing engineering principles with my crew, presenting design concepts to clients. She heard industry experts describing my company as innovative and highly respected. She realized, finally, that I had built something extraordinary while she had been dismissing it as playing in dirt. She apologized again, more thoroughly this time, for every diminishing comment and every comparison to Gregory's supposedly superior career. She said she had been wrong about everything, and she wanted to learn about my actual life, instead of the imaginary version she had constructed in her mind. I told her I appreciated her willingness to see me clearly, and that we could build a better relationship starting from this foundation of honesty. It would not erase the past damage, but it offered possibility for different future. Todd called me 5 days after the segment aired, leaving a voicemail that made me laugh out loud in my office. He had seen the show. He had done extensive research about my company. He wanted to propose a business partnership where he would invest $2 million in exchange for 20% equity and a position on my board of directors. He said we had history together, that he understood my vision better than any outside investor could, that we would make an excellent team. He actually used the phrase power couple in reference to combining his financial expertise with my creative talents. He mentioned almost as an afterthought that he had always known I would be successful eventually, that breaking up with me had been a strategic mistake he regretted deeply. I deleted the voicemail without responding because some people are exactly as shallow as they appear, and no amount of success changes their fundamental nature. Todd had not called because he regretted hurting me, or because he valued me as a person. He called because my net worth had increased beyond his initial assessment, and he wanted access to resources I represented. That kind of calculation does not deserve the courtesy of a response. The Riverfront project reached substantial completion 6 months after Gregory's sentencing, transforming a neglected industrial area into a vibrant public space, featuring walking paths, native plantings, interactive water features, and gathering areas designed for community events. The mayor held a ribbon-cutting ceremony on a perfect spring morning, with local media coverage and speeches from various officials taking credit for vision they had not actually possessed. I arrived early to do a final walkthrough and discovered someone had spray-painted obscenities on one of the main feature walls overnight. My stomach dropped. We have 3 hours before the ceremony. My crew mobilized immediately, mixing paint and deploying power washers while I dealt with the police report and the mayor's panicking assistant. We covered the damage with strategic plant placement and temporary banners, transforming the vandalism into an improvised design element that actually enhanced the space. Later I learned, through Warren's network, that a competing landscape firm had been responsible, someone who had lost the original bid to my company and decided sabotage was appropriate revenge. The police investigation was ongoing. I stood with my crew watching politicians pose for photographs beside fountains we had designed and defended, feeling proud not just of the work, but of our ability to solve problems under pressure. Warren approached during the reception afterward, champagne in hand, and told me the development group was so pleased with the results that they wanted to discuss expansion into 2 additional cities. He said my company was now positioned to compete nationally for major projects, that the combination of excellent work and media exposure had elevated Fowler & Company into a different category of landscape architecture firms. I looked around at the space we had created, watching families already using the pathways and children playing in the splash pad we had designed to be both beautiful and functional. This was real. This was lasting. This mattered in ways that Gregory's financial manipulations never had and never would. Dad attended the ribbon-cutting ceremony in his wheelchair, his cognitive decline having progressed to the point where walking long distances was no longer safe. He held my hand during the speeches and told me repeatedly how proud he was, how beautiful everything looked, how I had built something wonderful. He asked if I remembered helping him in his garden when I was little, how I used to dig holes and plant seeds with such serious concentration. He said he always knew I would do something special with my life, something that grew and flourished and brought beauty into the world. His memory was fragmenting, returning to moments from decades past, while recent events disappeared like morning fog. But his pride in me was clear and present and real. Mum stood beside his wheelchair with her hand on his shoulder, tears running down her face as she watched me accept congratulations from city officials and industry colleagues. She had brought a camera and took approximately 500 photographs, most of them blurry or poorly framed, but her intention was what mattered. She was documenting my achievement, creating evidence that her daughter had succeeded spectacularly, despite every obstacle placed in her path. I stood on the observation deck at sunset, my crew gathered for a team photograph. These 47 people who trusted my leadership represented family more than blood ever had. We had created beauty together. We had solved complex problems together. Gregory was in federal prison. Todd was somewhere planning cosmetic procedures and delusional partnerships. My mother was learning slowly to see me clearly. And I stood in a space I had designed, surrounded by people I valued, looking at a future filled with projects and possibilities. My boots were muddy. My hands bore calluses and dirt under the fingernails, and I had never been happier. Some people measure success in corner offices. I measured it in spaces that would serve communities for generations. The Stinky Sister had built an empire from dirt and determination, and she was just getting started.